All right, everybody. Welcome to the Impact Collab on Human Rights. My name is Jamie, and I'm a Community Engagement Manager here at B-Lab US and Canada. And I am thrilled and honored to be your host for today's Impact Collab. So thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to get started. If you haven't seen the messages in the chat, feel free to update your name and your pronouns in your Zoom control bar, and then we'll get started with a little bit of housekeeping. So you can control closed captioning on this call on the control bar. So you should see a little CC button and you can click that and that will control if and when the closed captioning shows up on your screen. We'll also be recording the standards content that we talk about here, and we'll share the recording in the follow-up email afterwards. However, we will be ending this call in breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will not be recorded or shared, so we really want you to share freely and candidly in those breakout rooms, and we hope you can stay for those. Amazing. I know we are joining here from many virtual spaces, but we're also calling in from the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. I myself am calling in from the lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, colonially known as Denver, Colorado, where I am very grateful and thrilled to be enjoying my favorite time of year, which is the transition from summer to fall. And if you're from here, you know the aspens start to change and people start thinking about skiing, and it's lovely to be here during that time. So please share which territory you are from in the chat. And if you don't know, we'll share a link that help you find it. Okay, and as some of you might know, today's event is part of our larger Impact Lab series that covers each impact topic, one per month. And today we are diving into our sixth topic, which is amazing. Has anyone here been to all six calls? Amazing, love. Feel free, raise your hand, put it in the chat. It's a lot of work and a lot of time. So thank you all for being so open and excited to learn with all of us. If you would like to join the last two of the year, feel free to register on the Beehive. The next one is on October 23rd. It's purpose and stakeholder governance. And we'll wrap up with foundation requirements in November. Okay, I am personally so excited for the content that we are going to have today. Our call will start with an introduction to the human rights topic by Bernard at BLG, or BLab Global, excuse me. And we are lucky enough to be joined by Cappy Q and Tony's Chuck Lonely, who will be sharing their expertise and lived experience in the human rights space. Then we'll share some calls to action, answer questions live, and we will end in breakout rooms where you'll have the practical guidance from human rights experts and the opportunity to learn from other B Corps with amazing practices in their fields. For the Q&A, if you could put any questions that you have in the question and answer feature on your Zoom control bar, that allows our amazing Q&A team to answer all the questions that you have throughout the call. Make sure to upvote any that resonate with you or you would like to see voiced over live, and we'll share a couple that have the most upvotes or thumbs up during that section. Cool. So today we will be giving you an introduction to the human rights impact topic. We'll be answering general questions about the human rights impact topic and providing examples and resources from the B Corp community and partners to help you meet that requirement. Today, we won't be able to answer specific questions about your company or the insurance model or recertification timelines. But if you have questions about that, we are happy to answer them outside of this call. You can email me at community@bcorporation.net, and that'll come to me or my lovely colleague Carson, and we can find all the answers for you. And like I said, if you have questions related to the human rights impact topic, feel free to put those in the Q&A function. And now I will pass over to the amazing Bernard Gao at B-Lab Global, who is an expert in our social standards at B-Lab Global, to introduce the human rights impact topic.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Hi, one pleasure to be here with you. I'm very excited to talk about human rights because I think looking at the three social impact topics, we have justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, JEDI, fair work, and human rights. I think looking at those three, if implemented well, human rights, this impact topic has the biggest potential for positive impacts. So let's dive into the requirements and we can get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly is expected. And as already mentioned, if there are any questions, please pop them into the Q&A function, and then we can get to them at the end. So we have four groups of requirements, HR1 to HR4. You can look at HR1 and 2 as setting the foundation. It's about a public commitment and then identifying so-called salient issues and creating a strategy. So that kind of sets the foundation. And then HR3 and 4 are all about the doing, making stuff happen. This is where you're addressing those impacts. And then in HR4, where you're working with suppliers or in your procurement activities, you're making better choices that align with your human rights objectives. We're going to go through each one in more detail. Now, before we go and talk about requirements, we need to understand what are we talking about when we say human rights. The human rights impact topic is actually about human rights due diligence. Now, for those less familiar with the term, due diligence, and this is my personal take on what due diligence means, it just simply means being careful, or that companies operate with care. Let's imagine that we're all a company together. We practice financial due diligence. We are careful because we don't want to lose money. That means we are proactive. That means we do research before making decisions, before actions. We think about what are the possible ways in which we might lose money, and we change our behavior. What we want to see in human rights due diligence is the same kind of thinking, but then for human rights impacts. So we are careful because we don't want to have negative impacts on people or negative impacts on human rights. But it's that same thinking. It's about being proactive. It's about thinking before you make decisions, before you take those actions. It's about researching and understanding where your potential issues or your potential impacts may be. All right, let's look at company size, because as I go through the slides and the requirements, for those that have been on these sessions before, you'll know that those requirements are linked to your size. And it's important then that everyone here knows your company size. It's also good for us to know who's in the room. So if you look at this table, it'll help you calculate your company's size. Note that there's a difference to how it has been working under version 1.6 of our standards. The way it works now is size is determined either by the number of workers at your company or revenue, whichever is higher. Let's go over a quick example. Let's say my company has 60 people FTE, that stands for full-time equivalent. 60, I'll look at the middle. I might think, okay, I'm medium, but hang on a minute. I'm making 200 million in annual revenue, so that would push me up to the large category. Have a look. Once you figured it out, or if you already know, please pop into the chat what size your company is. And that'll help us get a sense of who is in the room. Excellent. I'm already seeing some small, medium, lots of small, medium, and micro. I think I saw one XL. Fantastic. I get the impression that some of you have been on these calls before because you know your size already. That was very, very quick. Okay, I think we can move forward. So let's talk a little bit about HR1, which is about a public commitment to respecting human rights. This is a fairly straightforward one, probably the easiest of the four requirements. So we have HR 1.1 and 1.2, and this is, they're both about the same thing, about a public commitment to human rights. 1.1 is an easier version of 1.2, and 1.1 focuses on smaller companies. You can see that written at the bottom of the screen for micro and small for all sectors, for example. And then if you're a service with minor footprint and medium, then this applies to as well. So that's 1.1, and that's to put out a public statement saying we align with certain frameworks and standards, such as the International Bill of Human Rights and the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights. What you're meant to commit to is specified very clearly in the sub-requirement. 1.2 is a more demanding version of this. Instead of just a public commitment, there has to be a public policy, and there's a few more expectations that fall under that. And as I mentioned, that's for larger companies. HR2 is all about knowing what we call your salient human rights issues. Now, let's dive into this because you may not be familiar with the term salient. So, in the business and human rights space, there's a bit of an allergy to the word material, which is a word you're probably more familiar with, because for a long time and still in many circles, material means financially material. So, to make a clear distinction in the business and human rights space, we say salient instead of material. To make it very clear, we're not talking about financial materiality, we're talking about impact on people, so impact materiality. But in simple terms, saliency is a synonym for materiality. The way we use materiality in the environmental topics or in purpose and stakeholder governance, it's a synonym for saliency here. So not a massive difference. It's simply to make a distinction between what is salient in the human rights space versus what is financially material. Let's dive into these sub-requirements. So HR 2.1 and 2.2 are all about identifying those salient issues. So the issues, the human rights that are most likely impacted by your company's operations. This is a list of prioritized issues. Most companies have around 5 to 10. And you would expect to see things there like forced labor in the supply chain or wage discrimination amongst my own operations. Those are the kinds of issues you would see on a list. And it basically is a signal for the company to say, this is where my company is most likely to have negative impacts on human rights. It's a very important cornerstone of human rights due diligence, because if we think of due diligence, the scope is enormous, can be even quite daunting because it covers everything. It covers clients, supply chain, end consumers, your corporate customers, your own workforce. That's a massive scope. So an important part of due diligence is knowing where to focus. And the saliency assessment that you do, where you identify your salient issues, helps you know where to focus your efforts. If we then look at HR 2.3, 2.4, and 2.5, that's about creating a strategy and making progress on that strategy. And that strategy is then based on the salient issues. Please note that HR 2.5, which is all about publicly communicating on the progress against that strategy, is only applicable to the XXL size. Lastly, we have 2.6 and 2.7, which is all about policy alignment. This is where you develop policies that align with your salient issues. So for example, if forced labor in your supply chain was a salient issue, then you should have a policy on forced labor in your supply chain. So that's what we mean with policy alignment. You can see what we're doing with HR 2.3 to 2.7. It's all about shaping your business practices so that you're focusing on those salient issues that you uncovered under 2.1 and 2.2. This is, again, a very important part of human rights due diligence, shaping your business practices to focus on the areas that matter most. HR3, so this is where a lot of the action kicks in. The company prevents, mitigates, and remediates impacts. Let me explain those 3 words just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Actually, I'm going to use an anecdote from my auditing days. I once went to a coffee decaffeination plant where they use massive machines, like the kind of machines that fill an entire room, and they were really noisy. Now, what they did is they had the people working on these machines, they wore ear protectors. That is an example of mitigating the risk of hearing damage, because the noise is still there, but the chance that the hearing damage occurs is mitigated, it's reduced. If the company, the factory wanted to prevent hearing damage, the risk of hearing damage, they would maybe replace the machines with ones that don't make noise. That's preventing. Remediating is when the damage has actually happened. Someone has hearing damage, and the company says, we're very sorry this has happened. We're going to send you to the doctor. We'll cover your bills. We'll give you whatever other compensation might be appropriate, and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. So ideally, your company is preventing and mitigating It may happen that something materializes and becomes an actual impact, in which case you then remediate. Let's have a look at the sub-requirements here. So 3.1 is all about collecting information, processing it, and escalating it within your company. So you might already do this for human resources issues. If someone has a grievance, a worker grievance, you will likely have a process to look at it. Is more investigation needed? Who needs to be involved to make a decision about how to take this further? If you're in the food and beverage sector, you likely already have something in place for food safety issues and product recalls. It's that kind of stuff we want to see, but then for all kinds of human rights issues, if there's an issue in the supply chain, what happens with that information so that the right people are making the right decisions within your organization? 3.2 is about preventing, mitigating, and remediating. What the auditor will look for are examples of your company actually doing that. What actions has your company taken? Reflecting on all the other actions that you've taken under human rights. How are you preventing? How are you mitigating issues? And how have you remediated any issues, any impacts that there have been? What you'll see at the bottom is all of this applies from the medium and large size and above, which is a recurring theme in this impact topic. When we get to HR 3.3 and 3.4, we have a slightly different category we're dealing with here. 3.3 is for companies in the professional services industries. And in the standard, we specify exactly which kinds of industries fall under this, are subject to this sub-requirement. Think of consultancy, law firms, these would fall under 3.3. What we're expecting to see here is some kind of screening process to think about potential clients, potential meaning before you take on a new client or project, think about the potential negative human rights impacts. So for example, if you're an architecture firm and you're working with the Saudi government on a new building project, what is that building project for? What are the potential negative impacts that you might be contributing to? You'll need to be able to think that through, have a document that can demonstrate, look, this is how we're thinking about potential impacts through potential clients. 3.4 is a version of that, but it's for a slightly different group. It only applies to the two industries, equity investing and investment advising. And essentially, it's about screening potential investments in the same manner. What are the potential negative impacts those investments may have, and how are you mitigating those issues? Three 3.5 is to carry out an impact assessment, and this is only for XL and XXL. In a human rights impact assessment, it's a little bit confusing because it's slightly different than what you would see under ESC in the environmental space. A human rights impact assessment is not top level. It's actually very detailed and goes very much into a specific issue. So maybe you're opening up a new factory in a new location. Your impact assessment will look very closely at what are the potential or actual issues in relation to that one decision or that one new product line or something along those lines. So it's a detailed assessment that your company would have to do. Then 3.6, we expect companies to look at whether they have operations in any conflict-affected situations. It does not apply to a company that is based. Let me give you an example. Say the company is based in Ukraine. It doesn't apply to them. It only applies to internationally operating companies that maybe have operations as subsidiary in a conflict-affected situation, like in Ukraine. So what companies are expected to do is first understand, do I have any operations, direct operations in a conflict-affected situation? And if they do, they have to meet certain extra criteria to meet so-called heightened due diligence. And what those expectations are, they're clearly stipulated in this sub-requirement in the standard. HR4 is a dedicated requirement focusing on working with suppliers. 4.1, 4.4, and 4.5 are all about working with suppliers, making sure that there's some kind of monitoring program, and starting to look at the concept of responsible contracting. Again, if you look at the bottom, this kicks in at the medium and large sizes. 4.2 and 4.3 are for smaller sizes and focus more on procurement. So rather than thinking of supplier relationship, think more like buying coffee for the office, or maybe you're buying new laptops. How are you thinking about potential human rights implications when you're making those purchases? Because when you buy a laptop, you don't really have a supplier, right? Maybe you're buying it from a local supermarket or a local shop. So that's where we talk about procurement as opposed to dealing with suppliers, a slightly different relationship, and therefore we've crafted slightly different sub-requirements. 4.6 to 4.8 is all about traceability of raw materials. Think of cocoa, coffee, cotton, and only applies to XL and XXL in the manufacturing, agriculture, and wholesale and retail sectors. Lastly, we have supplier wages, 4.9 to 4.11. This kicks in at the medium and larger sizes. What we're expecting here is that you as a company start to look at wages of your suppliers. If you're in a service sector, this means you need to start looking at wages paid by your service suppliers. Think of cleaning, security, marketing services. If you're in other sectors like manufacturing, retail, you would then look at your suppliers in your more traditional supply chain, let's say, and you need to look at wage issues in relation to those suppliers. So issues related to living wage, maybe living income if you're sourcing cocoa, or collective bargaining. I'm going to leave it at that. That was a lot of information. Please, if there was any, if you do have any questions, pop them in the Q&A and we can address them later. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Your perspective and expertise is always so valuable in these calls. So thank you so much for being here. I want to now introduce Tanisha Boyer Robinson from CapEQ, who is a longtime partner of B Lab and has supported our racial equity impact improvement program, I think, since its inception. So thank you so much, Ty, for being here. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. And hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you and walking through these really critical standards. As Bernard said, this is so exciting because these standards have such an opportunity to have a ripple effect in so many ways. And we're here to figure out, how does this work? How does this work for me? What do I need to do? And people might have their heads down a little bit as we're thinking about implementation. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to ask everybody to pull back and pull up. And I want to take some time to remind you who you are as a community. So I know when I started my company in 2011, it was like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And that might be dating me, but there's this character in there named Richard Dreyfuss, and he runs around with wild hair and crazy antics and is seeing a vision that no one else can see. And I feel like I had that same kind of zeal. I knew I wanted to start a company that helped businesses and investors figure out how they could have their businesses be a force for good. And you couldn't change my mind and you couldn't change the subject. And that zeal pulled me towards organizations who had a similar feeling. That's who you are. And that's what this community is. When everyone else said it's not for business to care about the impacts of the world, you created models that were different. When everyone else said this should be philanthropy, you were like, no, this should just be the way the world works. This should just be the way that business works. And I want to remind us of that because as we start to evolve over the 20-year plus history of B Corps and B Lab, we've evolved in ways that we know multiplier effects and ways that make the world a better place. So it's not just about our business models anymore. This and these set of standards is really about harnessing the collective power and action of every single one of us, every policy, every procedure, every implementation. You're not now only just in community with others who have that like-minded Richard Dreyfuss wild-haired zeal. You're in community with others who collectively are having action and impact in every facet of your work. And so while we can get into the nitty gritty of is a micro and should I do this at a medium or am I an XL or a double espresso or a venti? What's really powerful about this is I'm doing this work in collaboration and coordination every day with people I may not see. And every time we change the way we operate with our suppliers, change the way we have our own policies and procedures, we are making communities stronger in very tangible ways. We are making sure children are not forced to work every day, but instead can live, learn, and play. We're making sure that their families are earning wages that allow them to have food and shelter and clothing. We're ensuring that no one is forced to work against their will. It's basically fighting in some places against slavery. We are making sure that people are treated with the dignity and the respect that we all deserve, simply because of the way that we run our business. And not only are we doing that together because of having very clear goals and standards, because of our collective action and impact, it will become a beacon for other organizations. See, this is not the first time people have talked about making sure you're focusing on human rights. BCG, McKinsey, Bain, they all talk about this work and talk about how large companies and others should pay attention to human rights. But they do it from a different vantage point. They often do it because, oh, well, you should pay attention to this because it's being regulated in certain areas and you don't want to violate and you don't want your reputation to be at risk. Nah, homies, that's not we're doing it. We're doing it because we know collectively our work can be the change we want to see. So I wanted to start there before we get into a little techniques, because that's the energy and the lens that we need to bring into the execution and the implementation of these standards. So I'm going to share a little exercise with everybody, because one of the exciting things about human rights is you can't do it alone. You know, for decades, we have worked at CAPIQ building and supporting cross-sector collaboratives. And the only way you can change how the world does business in a way that affects community outside of you is to do it in partnership and collaboration. So I'm going to give you a quick, simple set of tools and exercises that you can take back with you as you start to think about all the stakeholders that you're going to need to start to engaging as you start to implement what is the change we need to see to make sure that we are actually helping uphold and support human rights. So the first question is a basic one. Whoa, if I think about all of my due diligence around human rights, how do I get stakeholders, whoever they may be? People are talking right now about clients and suppliers, but there might be others that you need to get involved. How do I get my stakeholders to partner on this work? Well, it's basically 4 steps, and everything you see us do at CAPIQ is making things simple, digestible, and accessible. The first is inspire, the next is to start with converted, the third is partner, and the next is share success. Let's start with inspire, and I couldn't imagine a better picture than Doc Tiffany Jana. So I want to invite you to write a couple sentences about what inspires you about this work and why you want others to join you. And I'll give you a little bit of time on that. We won't take too much time because I know we have a clock and we got to get to a great example. You're going to love the next example. But write those a couple sentences. You know, I started with why I care about this work and this whole conversation. And I love all the emojis and reactions. You're going to see the same thing from your stakeholders. And it's less about telling them they have to implement this standard or you've switched the way you're doing your work, and more about grounding and reminding people about the unique opportunity you have to collectively drive change. Then if we go to the next slide, the next step is really about starting with the converted. You know, we often are trying to push people to change things. No, you want to start with the folks who are already in the choir, the people that you can think of who would be compelled to do this work with you. Because let's be honest, we're all going to be learning as we're implementing these standards. There are going to be bumps in the road. There are going to be things that you're not sure of. There are going to be stuff that you uncover that you're surprised by. If you start with the converts, you will have a relationship where you have enough vulnerability with each other to really think through and find these solutions together. So as you start to spread it beyond just the folks who are converted, you have a safe space to land while you're doing that work. Going to the next slide, it's really about, I want to make sure that as you think about doing this work, you're not centering yourself as a company. You're not even necessarily centering the standards and the details of the standards. This is a great tool called the result at the center. You're centering what is the change you're trying to see. So if, for instance, one of the things that comes up as a big issue across your supply chain is actually having unsafe working conditions, you put that at the center of your work. And then you figure out, who are the stakeholders I need to engage that have some role to play in that? That helps you brainstorm not just the converted, but also a holistic approach. So it could be healthcare. If unsafe working conditions are creating challenges with people's health and safety, it could be faith-based communities. If the people who are in the labor force tend to congregate there, there's all sorts of different ways to line the circles around the chart, but it's a great exercise to help you figure out if you can't solve human rights alone, but you know you want to have positive impact, who do you need to be partnering with to do that? Which takes us to our next thing, partnership. This is really not about a top-down situation. And all too often when we're doing cross-sector work, businesses and investors come in as experts and ways they want to do things, as opposed to really looking themselves as part of a collaborative. So this is homework for you. As you think about what inspires you, as you think about the stakeholders you want to have involved, pull back and think about what does partnership look like where we can go together on this journey and put supports in place, because we need to make sure that we are supporting each other as we're learning and working through this. There are going to be reasons behind why unsafe working conditions exist. And as you uncover those reasons, you're going to learn new things. So it's important to come into, as you're building the stakeholder engagement, with a sense of vulnerability and partnership. And lastly, as you think about how you get stakeholders engaged with the work, imagine success and start sharing success. So that's the last slide. It's really about, as you're showing your impact, as you start to show, we ended unsafe conditions. That changed people's lives. It had this bottom line impact. It had this community impact. And these are the 5 ways we got them done. You're going to create a magnet. You're going to be a snowball for other stakeholders who want to be engaged. You should be proudly sharing that success in a way that helps multiply your effects and your impacts with everything else that you've done. I hope this helps ground all of the work. I want to share with you that we've done lots of cross-sector stakeholderships. We've helped a corporate procurement cohort. We do impact investing support. So we are here to support you too. If there's anything we can do to help you as you go along this journey, if you go to the last slide, you can find us at info@CAPIQ Impact. Thank you so much for giving me some chance to talk about how exciting these standards are, and I'll turn it back to the BLAB team.
Thank you, Ty, so much. I think you did a beautiful and amazing job balancing the heart and the why of the B Corp movement with steps that make it feel not so looming and scary, but really why we do this work. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I am so excited to introduce a B Corp that we know, and most of you probably know and love. It's Tony's Chocolonely, and we're so thrilled to have Danny here to share how they are a champion of human rights. So Danny, please take it away.
Thanks, Jamie. Ty, I'm going to try to match your energy. Thank you for that. That was awesome. Yeah, let me kick things off with the why, right? Which is Tony's origin story, which I think is a truly unique story, and one that hopefully is going to help frame everything I'll dive into today. So about 20 years ago, many of you probably remember the release of the Willy Wonka movie starring Johnny Depp. Around that same time, a Dutch journalist named Teun, you guys know him as Tony, began investigating the cocoa industry through a television show that he co-hosted with some other journalists. And what they uncovered was widespread child labor in cocoa production. And when it became clear that no one was taking action, Teun did something I'd say was a bit radical. He literally self-incriminated, taking himself to court for knowingly purchasing chocolate made with illegal labor in an effort to hold the industry accountable. At the same time, he was also approaching major chocolate companies, ones that we know, with a bold idea, right? To co-produce a chocolate bar free of child labor, using the movie's launch as a moment to spotlight it. Not only did they reject the proposal, but they openly admitted that illegal labor was present in their supply chains and claimed it wasn't possible to change. So Tony, along with a few co-founders, they found a small co-manufacturer willing to take the risk, and together they launched what we now know as Tony's Chocolonely, producing an initial run of 5,000 ethically sourced chocolate bars, a small but really powerful start to to a movement that challenged the status quo of the cocoa industry. So today, I work for Tony's Open Chain. This is where we invite other companies to source cocoa the same way Tony's Chocolate Only does, by collaborating at origin. That means working with the same partner cooperatives same partner cooperatives and farmers, where our 5 sourcing principles are actively in place. And I'll touch on those 5 sourcing principles in a minute. I think what's really powerful about this model is that it allows companies to, like it says here, collaborate on cocoa while still competing on chocolate, whether it's flavor, branding, shelf presence. The core idea is that collaboration and competition aren't mutually exclusive. Rather, they go hand in hand to drive meaningful change in the industry. So if we move to the next slide here, I'll just give a little bit of context of what we're seeing in the region. Tony's and Tony's Open Chain works exclusively in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. That is not random. It's by design. These 2 countries produce over 60% of the world's cocoa. Yet, despite that scale, the supply chain is deeply fractured, right? You have 2.5 million smallholder farmers growing cocoa on small plots of land. And that fragmentation is really a big reason why so many of the problems in cocoa persist today. It's also where the opportunity, the responsibility, as you'll hear me say often, to change the system is the greatest. We often call it ground zero for cocoa, where real change has to start. And so if we move to the next slide, the 3 interconnected challenges we've identified at origin are poverty, illegal labor, mostly in the form of child labor, as we'll talk about today, and deforestation. The first, as you see here on the left, is poverty, which is the root cause. Or
Danny, I can't hear you anymore. Is anyone else having that problem? Yes.
can you guys hear me now?
You're back.
That is weird. Okay.
The last
that's
thing
good.
I heard was you were talking about poverty, illegal labor, and deforestation, and how you're going to get into that.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so just kind of hitting on the 3 interconnected challenges here, right? So if we look at poverty, what I was saying is that is really the root cause or the precondition to all other challenges. So I mentioned the 2.5 million smallholder farmers on that last slide. Most of them remain underpaid, earning well below a living income, right? That means being able to afford essentials like food, healthcare, or education, never mind investing long-term in their farms. And so that leads to the other 2 challenges, one being child labor. Families can't afford hired labor or school fees. So what we see is currently 1.5 million children that are engaged in cocoa production across West Africa. That means often missing school to work on family farms. And then the third one is the third challenge that is at origin is deforestation. If farmers are unable to invest in better yields, soil health, of course, they're often forced to clear forests to plant more cocoa. And so in the last 30 years, you've seen in Ghana, they've lost 65% of its forest cover, and in Cote d'Ivoire up to 90%. You add an extreme in recent climate shock in the region, and the risk to both people and planet grows larger, right? Farmers are stuck in this vicious cycle that I keep describing, being able to afford investment into their farms, and that creates an abundance of aging and diseased cocoa trees, in addition to the increased social risk, right? Like child labor. So naturally, production has reduced significantly in both countries by almost 1 million metric tons over the last 3 years, and that's led, if for those who are in cocoa, you know this, to the market's reaction where prices reached unprecedented highs in late 2024. This is why we started Tony's Open Chain, right? To bring companies in the sector through a shared impact model to tackle these exact issues. And so on this next slide, right, like what does the impact model actually look like? At the core of Tony's Open Chain, as I was saying before, are our 5 sourcing principles. These aren't standalone actions. They all reinforce each other and are foundational in how we work to make cocoa sourcing more responsible, more transparent. Today, we'll focus on the human rights issue of child labor, which is mostly addressed in our traceability principle, which in itself rests on 3 pillars. One of them we call social traceability, meaning we know who is growing our cocoa and under what conditions. Again, this is where our child labor work lives. It allows us to actively monitor for child labor and support remediation when we find it. We heard Bernard talking a lot about monitoring and remediation and prevention, which I'll talk about as well. I also said earlier that it's our, and when I say our, like meaning any company sourcing high risk commodities, our responsibility to take full control of our supply chains. To take ownership, you have to take responsibility to understand the realities in the countries producing said commodity. For Tony's, that's cocoa and that's child labor. I sit at the commercial side of the business, working with companies sourcing cocoa through our open chain solution. Ty, I saw Ben & Jerry's on your slide. Ben & Jerry's is a partner of ours who we call a mission ally to help them step into that responsibility. That is my role, but the real work is really being led by our teams at Origin in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, who work hand in hand with our human rights teams and other teams based in Amsterdam. Ideally, they're the ones here being able to talk about this. Luckily for me, I get to do that today. I joined in January, so it was like immediately clear to me that this work, especially around child labor, isn't some side initiative. It's truly and deeply embedded in how we operate. And so as I've been, as I've been learning more about the realities on the ground, it's also super clear that many of these challenges, like child labor, they're not unique to cocoa, but for us, a company that works in cocoa, it obviously makes these challenges even more visible in a way that demands action. So on the next slide, you can see what we've implemented, and that's our child labor monitoring and remediation system, our CLMRS. Across our entire supply chain with 100% coverage. That means every cooperative in our network implements CLMRS, and every farmer household is included. When you look at other systems, they often monitor maybe a portion of their supply chain. They're rotating household visits every few years, but every household in the Tony's Open Chain Network is visited annually. And this is super important. They're carried out by trained community facilitators. These are members of the cooperative teams who live in the communities. They know the families, they're trusted locally, and then they're further supported by a monitoring and remediation agent. These are folks who are helping coordinate work and ensure that remediation plans are not just relevant, but also well-resourced. When you think about remediation, it can happen at three levels. First, at the individual level, meaning with the child. That could be reintegrating them back into the education system, meaning obtaining a birth certificate for school enrollment. Maybe it's providing school kits with essentials like notebooks, uniforms, or even bikes to those traveling longer distances. The second is household level, where families may receive tools like wheelbarrows or safe cocoa pod openers to help other children safely contribute to family farming activities. It might mean supporting families with startup kits, other tools, seeds for other income generating sources, so families can then hire labor for key income sources, in this case cocoa farming, instead of relying on their children. And then the third level of remediation that we look at is at the community level, right? Working with partner organizations at Origin, also alongside the Chocolonely Foundation, to improve the broader enabling infrastructure. The issue is not something only one actor can solve alone. It takes collective action, right? Between companies who source cocoa, like Tony's, of course, B Corp, B Corps, but also civil society, NGOs, government. So why it's important to be in spaces like this too, with people tackling the issue from different angles. I think if there's like one thing to remember from my talk, it's that like this isn't about enforcement. When we think about our CLMRS system, it's not about catching children. 95% of the child labor cases in our network are identified through open conversations with families, the children themselves. That's really the heart of our approach, right? Building trust, understanding the social realities, and working together to find better options. We've introduced labor brigades, right? Not just as a remediation tool, but as a prevention tool that helps families access safe labor alternatives before child labor becomes a necessity. And so if we look at the next slide, and this is the last slide, you'll see the number of cases detected at our partner cooperatives with CLMRS. You'll see here on the left, right, like newer partner cooperatives face higher child labor prevalence rates, of course, right, when we onboard them, that are consistent with industry averages in their initial monitoring years. Then over time, as you can see, kind of moving to the right, prevalence rates go from the industry averages, which is around 50% prevalence, to what was 3.9% prevalence rate in our long-term partner cooperatives last season, what we call harvesting co-ops. It's also worth mentioning, right, beyond the labor brigades, Bernardo was also talking about prevention, that there are other prevention mechanisms at play to mitigate the risks of child labor before remediation is actually required. So contextualize sensitization is one, right? That means we're conducting awareness raising sessions tailored to local realities, helping families understand the risks of child labor and the value of education, as an example. Productivity support is another, right? We've recently launched a major upgrade to our 5 sourcing principles with a specific focus on strengthening our productivity programming, directly addressing the issues of declining yields, which I mentioned earlier as another important issue. Another prevention strategy is improving access to things like education, healthcare, clean water, sanitation, really creating that enabling environment that I was saying where children can thrive. And I know I'm probably a little bit over time here, so just as a closing thought, like I'll reiterate what I said before. It's hard for companies to take responsibility for their supply chains unless they understand the realities of the households and the families within it. For us at Tony's Open Chain, that means taking accountability for protecting more than 50,000 children in the households in the households that we source from. And that's also why we work not just with families, right, but other partners in our own supply chain, and also other organizations in the sector to improve that broader enabling environment. Monitoring alone isn't enough. Remediation alone isn't enough. Real change comes from true collaboration, steady progress at the community level, with a belief that children's rights are human rights. Every child has a right to be safe, to go to school, to have a say in their future. These aren't like some crazy abstract ideals. They're really practical foundations for a more just and a more sustainable cocoa sector. That's what Tony's Open Chain is built on. And yeah, that's what we're here to keep building together with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. That was amazing. And thank you, Ty and Bernard, for sharing with us today. All of you have shared such valuable insights into a complex but really incredibly meaningful set of challenges and opportunities that I think the human rights impact topic touches on. One thing that I heard throughout your presentations is that we are really all starting from somewhere. We all have a mission. We all care about people. But no matter where we are, as Ty said, you're learning as you go. And this impact topic has so much opportunity to make real change in the world. That's another theme I heard. But also, we all know change does not happen overnight, and often it unfolds like one step at a time, or maybe even one sub-requirement at a time. But each step takes and pushes your respective companies to make this world a better place in a way that I think only businesses really can. So thank you, Danny and Ty and Bernard, for showing us the way. And thank all of you on this call for being part of a movement that strives to be better, that stands for the fundamental rights of all people, especially those disproportionately impacted by unjust systems and social inequity. There is a lot to do, and a lot of challenges to overcome. And we recognize that these are an ambitious set of goals, but like we've said, we are all in it together. And I personally am so proud to be in this community with all of you. So thank you for being here. And now I'm going to take us over to some calls to action, to ground in action. If you could join the Human Rights Group on the Beehive to continue the conversation. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, you can dig into the Immersion online course, which is free and self-paced. You can also check out all the resources that we have on the human rights topic, like the topic summary. We'll share a guide after this call to really hear more examples. And if you need support or you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to reach out via the Beehive or, like I said, at community@bcorporation.net. And I think we can go to the next slide. And if you just cannot get enough from all of these impact collabs, which I hope you can't, the next one is October 23rd. It's on purpose and stakeholder governance, and I think it's going to be a really great opportunity to dig into a really foundational piece of this B Corp puzzle. So I hope you all can join us. It's Holly's favorite topic, so I hope you can come. And you can register on the Beehive for that one. And now I'll pass it to Sylvia for the Q&A.
Thank you, Jamie. I am super excited and energized with all the presentations today. Now we're going to go into the Q&A. We didn't get a lot of questions in the Q&A during the event. However, we have a couple of questions that were submitted through the Beehive or prior events. So I'm going to go through these questions with Bernard. The first question is, what happens if a company fails to identify or disclose a salient human rights issue?
Thanks. So quick reminder, when we talk about salient issues, we're talking about a company's priority issues. They're the human rights most at risk of being violated. Most companies have around 5 to 10 of these, but there's no strict number that it can't be more than 10 or less than 5. But of course, if we talk about where a company focuses, for most companies between 5 and 10 feels about right. Now, there is a lot of flexibility in the sense that we don't prescribe what a company's salient issues should be. Salient issues are highly context specific. So even within the same industry, two companies selling the same products could have different salient issues because of how they operate. So we don't prescribe a list. What we do in our standard is we essentially have criteria explaining what does a good saliency assessment look like. No surprise, stakeholder engagement is a very big part of that. What we're hoping to see is that a good quality process leads to a good quality outcome. Now, if your company is maybe doing it for the first time and maybe your research isn't as comprehensive as you would have hoped, and maybe you're struggling with the prioritization, those are unlikely to be things that the auditor will pick up on and give you a non-compliance. What is more likely to happen is if you're in an industry where there's very clearly a risk. So for example, if you work in mining and you never considered health and safety risks as one of your salient issues, that's a potential red flag. And the auditor will think, hey, how come you never considered health and safety? It doesn't mean health and safety has to be a salient issue if you're in mining. But if it hasn't even been considered, it suggests that the process hasn't been done well, and that could lead to a non-compliance. So again, we prescribe and we have detail around what a good process looks like. We don't prescribe what the outcome, what the actual list is.
Thank you, Bernard. We're getting incoming questions now, so I'm excited. Let's go to the next question. Why does Human Rights 2 only apply to medium-sized companies and above?
So you will all have seen a lot of the requirements kick in at that medium to large range. The reason for this is that if we look externally to other standards and frameworks, a lot of those focus on large companies. And a lot of that has to do with historically where the business human rights movement has come from. A lot of it has been focused on how do we get these large, often multinational corporations from committing gross human rights violations. So a lot of the work was focused on larger companies. And crucially, there was a new piece of legislation in the EU called CSDDD. It was a beautiful piece of regulation. There's been a bit of backtracking, but in any case, there's actually two pieces of regulation. CSRD, one of my colleagues can type it out in the chat what exactly it stands for. So CSRD and CSDDD, it's all about due diligence, reporting, but also on company performance on due diligence. Really, they were beautiful pieces of regulation. They originally were drafted to focus on the large from the 250 worker range and above. So originally we're thinking, let's align with that. But of course, B Corp goes above and beyond national regulation. So let's apply it for medium already. In that sense, we're going above and beyond expectations from the EU. Now, unfortunately, in recent months and the last year plus, those regulations have been watered down to only apply to even larger categories. So there is a bit of misalignment there. But given the priority of the issues we're trying to address, the many crises we have, we decided let's stick to this medium and large range in our standards. Just because the EU and other regulations are backtracking doesn't mean we have to.
That's great. Thank you, Bernard. Something that I've heard in the community is like, oh, human rights isn't really that relevant to me because I'm a service-based organization. That's really for only product-based organizations or mostly. Can you just talk a little bit about why this is relevant for service-based organizations?
Absolutely. So for all you service companies here thinking that, please be aware the expectations are increasing because all companies can have negative impacts. So crucially, if you're a service company, you can have negative impacts through your clients. So let's say you're in marketing and you help your clients sell stuff. Depending on what they sell, you might be helping them commit human rights violations, or you might be helping them have negative impacts. Even something like overconsumption through climate change has negative impacts on human rights. So what we want to see is all service companies being proactive, thinking through, in my relationship with my client, and if I help them with the service that I'm providing, am I contributing or do I have a link to any potential negative impact? So that's one big part. And there's another part of it. We spoke a little bit about procurement. So even though a service company doesn't have a traditional supply chain, right? So it's not like you're a clothing company where the cotton is turned into a piece of garment and then turned into a t-shirt. You don't have that kind of chain, but you are procuring things on the market. You have a choice of how you spend your dollars and how that impacts human rights. So we spoke about, so Danny presented about Tony's. When you are buying treats for the office, maybe you decide I'm going to buy Tony Chocolonely chocolate as opposed to some other kind of chocolate because you are then reducing your impact, a negative impact on human rights. So even service companies have impacts on human rights. A lot of it happens through clients, but a lot of it is also in your daily procurement decisions.
Awesome. Thank you, Bernard. We have a little bit more of a complex question that was submitted through the Q&A. It would be wonderful if you could enlighten us a little bit. How does undocumented labor and migrant rights tie into the human rights topic? And I know we just gave you this question on the fly, so I'll give you a little time to think about it.
So they're absolutely relevant because if we go back to this concept of salient issues, the experiences of these groups of people are quite unique. So the ways in which there might be negative impacts are very unique to these people. So if we talk about, for example, human rights, there are also rights specific to migrant work. There's something called the DACA principles. If you're interested, look it up. They're fantastic. It's all about specific rights that apply to migrant workers. And it's important to look at that lens. So if you, for example, either hire migrants for your own operations, or you know that they're used in your supply chain. So we know, for example, that if you source seafood from Asia, then there's a high likelihood of migrant workers in your supply chain. It's important to be aware of that and consider that in your saliency assessment and to think about, okay, because these people are in my supply chain, in my operations, and because I know that their experiences are so unique and they're actually generally at a higher risk of experiencing human rights violations, I need to make sure that I'm speaking to the right kinds of stakeholders, that I'm doing the right kinds of research, and that you need to see and bring them into your salient assessment to see whether they're one of your priority, one of your most salient issues. And then, of course, if they are, like we spoke about, you need policy alignment. So maybe migrant rights is one of your salient issues, then you would have a policy dealing with migrant rights or protection of migrant rights, either in your own operations or in your supply chain. So absolutely relevant if that's part of your operations. Of course, it is possible that because of your unique context, you don't really deal with this on a regular basis, in which case it'll be less relevant for your context.
Thank you, Bernard. That was a great answer. And thank you all for your great questions. It's time to move along to the breakout rooms. If you have additional questions, just know that you can always reach us at community@bcorporation.net, or you can ask us questions in the Beehive group, and we'll do the best to find answers for you. So today we have really incredible speakers in the breakout rooms. You're going to be able to choose your own adventure, how you want to learn more and lean more into the human rights topic. So if we go to the next slide, Haran, I want to get you all really pumped up and excited about these speakers that we have today. First, we have Mayreed Keeger from Shift Project, who works with companies to build capacity to identify, prioritize, and mitigate human rights risks. And we'll be going through due diligence and salient issues for large companies. Then we have Zoe Kroom from UK-based B Corp 2050, who works with clients to build engagement in human rights across multiple stakeholders, and we'll be discussing how to speak to your suppliers and other stakeholders about human rights. Then we have Abby Griffiths-Price, also from 2050, and she will be talking about salient issues for medium and smaller companies. Then we have Jenny Coleman from Canadian B Corp Equifruit. It's one of Canada's top growing companies and the leading fair trade certified banana importer in North America, talking about bringing human rights into the fruit supply chain in Latin America. And last, but definitely not least, we have Laura Schweitzer from Cho Chocolate, a B Corp based here in Berkeley, California, who is going to talk about human rights in the cocoa supply chain in Ghana, West Africa, where she is going next week. So thank you so much for joining all of the speakers. And in the next slide, we're going to see which breakout room is for each speaker. Please be ready to interact with each other. Please turn your cameras on. This is a great opportunity to meet each other, to have smaller conversation in smaller rooms. And I hope you all continue to learn and engage with human rights. And I'll pass it back to Jamie for some details.
Thank you, Sylvia. Okay, so these breakout rooms are open for 15 minutes and we'll end the call in these rooms. Thank you all, like we said, for joining us today. We had incredible speakers and there are still more to come. So excited to have you all here. We will share a post-event survey that will pop up when you leave. So please take that. That really helps us shape these calls to benefit as many stakeholders as possible. And thank you all to our speakers who are amazing and fabulous and just the best. So the breakout rooms should be open now. You'll see a little pop-up on your screen that says breakout rooms, and you'll be able to choose which one that you'd like to join. The names correspond to what you see on the screen. But if you need any support getting into a breakout room, feel free to come off mute. If you're not seeing the little pop-up, let us know. How we doing?